Weather University, sponsored by Gaston Roofing.
Welcome to Pinpoint Weather University. I'm meteorologist Brandon Lawson.
And I'm meteorologist Andrew Brightman. Thank you so much for joining us here. You know, I'm also so used to people introducing me, Brandon. I almost say my own name right there.
You can't forget your name, man. I always do that on the morning shows with Queen City News Now. Like Jason and them, or Julian will finish talking, and it's like, oh.
You always got to wait. Like, are they gonna introduce you, or are they giving you the pause to do it yourself?
Yeah, man, and it makes me like I forget my name. So
yeah, trust me, same boat.
Gonna have to have a talk with them about doing that in the morning. Just introduce me, man. So no, overall, we've got a really fun show coming up. We're gonna talk about the tropics heating up here.
The weekend boys taking over.
Yeah, we're taking over. We're talking about the tropics, and we're also going to be talking about this heat wave that is finally coming to an end. Unfortunately, it's coming to an end with a gloomy day today with all the clouds and stuff that we have overhead. So, Andrew, let's start with the tropics, man. I mean, the tropics heating up. Two named storms. What's happening here?
You know, it's been, I'd say, an average start to the season so far. There have been years where we've seen at this point we'd already be down to the F and G's at this point in the season. That has happened in the past. But I'd say very average to tropical storms, not very strong. That's all that we've seen so far, which is a good thing. We don't like tropical development. We'd always want a very, very below average season, but it's becoming more and more typical here. It's getting more and more active across the Atlantic basin. And the overall setup, still expecting an above average season, kind of a little bit of a la nada setting up here, Brandon, right now. So overall, sort of neutral to slightly above average of what we're going to see in development here.
Yeah, it's wild. You know, Andrea formed in the northern Atlantic last week. We had Barry form over the weekend, and both of these storms were maybe like minute storms. I mean, they were only around for like 8 to 12 hours, right? They weren't around very long. Andrea was no impact to land. Barry actually made landfall in Mexico.
Yep.
So we had our first landfalling storm of the year, just not in the U.S. And now I believe the pronunciation from what I was looking at yesterday is Chantal. Chantal is the next storm that we'd be seeing if we got a named storm. And we've got a disturbance in the Gulf right now. And really, it's a frontal boundary. It's going to essentially stall out over the southeast. And we can see that around this time of year. These frontal boundaries can lead to those areas of low pressure developing, Andrew. So definitely something we're going to be monitoring. 40% chance of, as of Wednesday afternoon, of this possibly becoming a tropical cyclone. It'd probably be a weaker system.
It doesn't look very impressive right now on infrared satellite imagery. Now, obviously, these things can change when we call it like homebrew and close to the coast development. Right. Things can spring up very quickly here, get the right dynamics in the atmosphere, but right now just doesn't look very impressive on the satellite imagery. But this is 40% over the next 7 days. Over the next 48 hours, it's zero, nothing. So not concerned in the near term, not going to cause any issues with your Independence Day plans, but just something to watch here. If we do see a little bit more development along the East Coast, the Southeast Coast, the Carolina coast, potentially as we go really over the end of the weekend and then into early next week. Just something we're keeping an eye on. I'm watching some of the tropical models. It's a weak area low pressure that develops. It could be one of those, what you were just describing, Brandon, one of those minute storms that we could see.
Yeah, and it's going to be a weaker system, likely mainly staying offshore. I mean, if you're heading to the beach this weekend or early next week, could be some higher rip currents along the coast for sure with this storm, but would be likely a weaker storm. And, I was looking at the shear, too, with this system. I mean, there is a lot of shear right now in that environment, especially when you're dealing with a frontal boundary in general with some of these tropical cyclones and these lows try to form along those boundaries. You usually have a lot of wind shear with them, and hurricanes really don't thrive well with that. You've got a lot of land interaction with Florida there. So, I mean, there's some chance with this as it gets into the Gulf Stream, some of those warmer waters as it's moving right along the East Coast there. But even then, I mean, we're talking about a tropical depression, low-end tropical storm if we had any development at all. So, I mean, the shear, the environment's going to be not going to be great. But something else, Andrew, we've been tracking over the last, I'd say, 3 weeks since hurricane season started was the Saharan dust.
Dusty.
Yeah, it was just so dusty in the Gulf and even into the Atlantic. And looking at the latest model data on the Saharan dust, it's really lightened up a bit in the Gulf, which is essentially providing less dry air.
More conducive for development.
Yeah, more conducive for development with these storms. And again, when you've got less dry air, it gives them all the moisture to work with. So, but the thing is, it looks like as we go into the weekend, Andrew, we're going to get kind of another push of that Saharan dust. And I mean, this happens for hurricane season. It's something that I think can sometimes be overshadowed.
Yeah, drier air sometimes it makes it more difficult for the air to condense in the cloud cover. Also, drier air means higher pressure as well, more sinking motion through the atmosphere. All these factors come together. So when you see a lot of dust, create that kind of haze you see as you look off in the distance, but also really can inhibit tropical development as well. So all in all, a little bit of a good thing, because also can cause some really spectacular sunsets we can see sometimes if we get just the right amount of Saharan dust in the atmosphere.
And I tell you what, when those bright hues, and we'll see it sometimes when we get the Canadian wildfire smoke down here, you get those bright red hues, how the light scatters. It looks so beautiful. I love some of those smoky sunrises and sunsets. Obviously, it's not a major issue unless it's creating, air quality concerns. But man, it can create some really nice sunrises and sunsets for sure with the way the light scatters. And I want to talk a little bit about the tropical climatology now around this time of year. We're not seeing a lot of folks, you think about hurricane season, you're thinking about these tropical waves coming off the coast, but around this time of year, we don't really see that very often. Most of these storms are essentially homegrown. They happen closer to the U.S. We'll see storms try to form in the Gulf, like we saw with Barry last week, and we also have a chance to see that with Chantal and with this frontal boundary. And then along the kind of the eastern U.S., you can kind of see where you have that big little bright orange shade there just south of New York. That's essentially where we saw Andrea form. These storms essentially form a little bit closer to the U.S. because there's so much shear in the Atlantic to start the hurricane season. Obviously, shear is not very good for storms. It rips them apart as they try to get taller. And It's not good for them. And there's a lot of wind shear in the Atlantic, so that's why these storms like to form a little bit closer to home there. And then when we get to August, Andrew, that's when we start seeing those big tropical waves.
That's when we really see the African easterlies start to take over, because early in the season we still have a subtropical jet, which means winds coming from the west through the main development zone of the Gulf, the Caribbean Sea, and then into the central Atlantic. And then obviously winds coming from the west as this tropical system is trying to go westward is not going to be very conducive for development. But then once we get into the main season, really later July, but especially once we get to the beginning of August, we see it switch where the tropical easterlies start to take over. You see a lot more of the true African waves coming off the coast and developing out in the central Atlantic Ocean. As you see, kind of then you get the big Bermuda high out in the central Atlantic, really controlling things. And then it just is how strong is that big ridge of high pressure out near Bermuda, steering these systems a little bit closer to portions of the U.S. homeland here. So just going to be watching that. But yeah, this is once we get into prime season here, August and September, when we have those easterlies really controlling things. We see the wind shear in the main development zone of the Gulf and the Caribbean start to break down, and that's when we see a lot more development out in the central Atlantic. We see systems developing in the eastern Caribbean versus the northwest Caribbean or the Gulf, or in close to the coast in the southwestern Atlantic.
Yeah, and I wanted to kind of put my mouse on there. Essentially see that Bermuda high just kind of set up right here in the western Atlantic, and sometimes that can shift a little bit further west. It can shift a little bit further east. We can kind of see how these storms are turning. You can kind of see at least the climatology, how these storms will turn. And they're, again, as Andrew was describing, they're turning around that Bermuda high that sets up there. It's just a climate, man, that's a tough word, Andrew. Climatological high that just sits there in the Atlantic, and wherever it is, it can really steer these storms. And that will be what we're watching here as we go later into the hurricane season, when these storms start forming a little bit further out there. And, tropics are heating up. Definitely know it's going to be an above average season this year. But something else that has also heated up, us here in the Queen City, across the Carolinas.
I thought that was just you, Brandon.
Yeah, I'm telling you, it's wild to think about. 13 days of 90 degrees or higher, Andrew. That is, it's impressive. We've seen higher streaks of this, but this is actually the long we had this 13-day stretch was longer than any stretch of 90-degree heat we had last year.
Yeah.
And it's just, something we've had to deal with.
Summer really started early here across the Carolinas, not just with the heat. You're talking about the days getting over 90 degrees, but the humidity as well, day after day.
Man.
And we saw it coming right as we got into the early mid part of June. We saw the ridge take over, and I just started noticing we're going to see dew points getting up into the 70s. And, both my wife and I were very sensitive to the humidity. Also, who likes high humidity? Unless you're truly in the tropics and you can go swan dive into the ocean, it's really not that fun to deal with dew points over 65. Over 70, it just feels miserable out there with the humidity. And that's something that we've really been seeing as well. There's been no breaks. We had a couple of days we've gotten the dew point maybe under 65 where it starts to get a little bit more tolerable. But we've had a lot of days, Brandon, with dew points over 65 and quite a few over 70 as well.
Yeah, just the air you can wear, that tropical air mass, and that is essentially was allowed those feels like temperatures last week to get up to about the 110 mark. And we were looking at those days above 90 degrees, Andrew. I was doing kind of just some looking back at some of the historic consecutive days above 90 degrees in Charlotte. Yeah. So looking at the top 5 heat waves, 1993, 33 days we did it, 33 days in a row. In 2007, we had 32 days in a row of 90-degree heat. And then the closest one, at least the most recent top 5 heat wave, was in 2020. So during COVID, we had a 20-day heat wave of 90-degree temperatures or higher from early July, or really early to mid-July to late July. So pretty nasty stretch. Luckily, nasty. I will say this heat wave ends today. We've had a lot of clouds today. Temperature's going to be struggling to kind of get out of the mid to upper 80s. So that's still a little win there. And Andrew, I'll say this, we've had the heat, and somebody else that's had to deal with the heat quite a bit were power companies. Duke Energy tells me they had historic usage when it came down to the heat last week in the summer season. But I spoke with Jeff Brooks, Duke Energy spokesperson. He talked to me about a meteorological metric that they actually use, that to track the demand, because essentially you've got to figure out how much demand is going to be needed for the grid for them to supply the power for us and make sure we keep the AC on. So we talk about that metric and talk about also what other customers can do to keep your lights on and to keep the grid going. And that's coming up right on the other side of the break here on Pinpoint Weather University. Again, this fun edition of Pinpoint Weather University.
Boys taking over.
Brandon Lawson, meteorologist Andrew Wright with the Weekend Boys here taking over the show. We'll be right back after the break talking with Duke Energy about how they keep up with the demand for heat. Welcome back into Pinpoint Weather University. I'm meteorologist Brandon Lawson. It was obviously extremely hot last week. We had triple-digit high temperatures in the Queen City, and we're still continuing the heat wave, but things finally ending a little bit, cooling down much for this week, which is really, really nice considering we had to deal with all that heat last week. And one company that had to deal with the high demand when it comes down to power was Duke Energy. And I do want to bring in spokesperson Jeff Brooks from Duke Energy. Jeff, thanks for coming on the show today.
Hey, Brandon, thanks for having me.
Jeff, when it comes down to power, it's very essential when it comes down to 100-degree high temperature days, because air conditioning is going to be just used across the region at an extreme level to keep things cool. How do you guys keep up with that demand when we have very, very hot summer days like we saw last week?
Well, really, the most important part of our job is to make sure your power is reliable every day. And to do that, we have to know what the demand for electricity is going to be at any one point in time throughout those days. So if you think about the electricity you're using right now, it was generated just a moment ago at a power plant somewhere on our system. So we're constantly looking at every hour of every day, what is the current demand for electricity? And then what is that demand for electricity going to be in the next hour and the hour after that? And all of that takes into account a lot of factors like weather and customer usage and temperature. And all of these things have to be considered so that we can build a forecasting model to be able to prepare and ask our power plants to generate the electricity we need to meet your energy needs at that any one moment.
And I know you guys have to use several metrics for this, right, in order to keep up, because you have to be able to, forecast the demand that's going to be needed for a given day. What kind of metrics do you guys use to tell what kind of demand you're going to have for not only a given day, but maybe a given week?
Well, we have an in-house team of meteorologists that monitors the weather every hour of every day. And that, you think about it's not just the Charlotte area, it's all of the Carolinas that we're serving. And so we're always looking at things like temperature, humidity, precipitation that's going on, demand for electricity that we anticipate, how much kilowatt hours you're going to use, how much power is available from our own power plants versus power we need to buy from other places in other states and other areas. All of that is really important. And it's amazing to watch, even as a thunderstorm comes across, how the change in demand for electricity can adjust. So we're constantly ramping up and ramping down our system. And as we think about that, that also translates into customer bills, because electricity use, especially air conditioning, is the biggest user of energy in your home. So the same thing we're doing at our power plants, in some ways, our customers are doing as they think about what are my bills going to be like for the next week.
I know as a meteorologist, we track something called cooling degree days, and that's a metric that I'm assuming you guys use to also tell what kind of demand will be used for a given day when it comes down to how much AC will be needed. Can you kind of talk about what cooling degree days are or is for our viewers?
Yeah, cooling degree days are a really important metric that allows us to compare one time period to another. It's a measurement that anticipates essentially the likelihood of using air conditioning in your home. So if you imagine a 65-degree day, you're probably not going to need to use a lot of air conditioning. You can open the windows, just enjoy the weather. But as you get above that, we're more likely to turn on the AC. So the way we figure it is you take the average temperature between the high and the low for the day, and then compare it to 65 degrees. And whatever that difference is the cooling degree day metric for that day. And why that's important is it lets us look at the likelihood of higher energy use, but also to be able to compare that to another time period. So if you're a customer, you might say, well, gosh, it was really hot this week or last week, and I used so much energy. But then you can use that metric to compare it maybe to the normal that we see for that week, or you can compare it to even last year. And that can help you to understand, is this really as abnormal as it feels, or is it just hot because that's what it is this time of year? For us, it helps us to be able to see the demand on the system and plan for that with the power we generate.
And I put a little graphic together for our viewers, kind of explain what cooling degrees are, just kind of looking at the different things. And you summed it up really well. Just it's a metric used to indicate how much air conditioning is needed for a given day. And the higher number of cooling degree days that we have, it means that there's going to be a greater need for air conditioning. And we're assuming 65 degrees. I love kind of the assumption because, like, I knew me, like 65 degrees, if it's outside, I might still have the AC or the heat going. But at 65 degrees, with cooling degree days, the assumption is that there's no air conditioning or heat needed in your home for 65 degrees outside. And I love how you kind of broke down the example, Jeff, talking about like the math that goes into this. So I wanted to kind of give an example for our viewers. So if we have a 70-degree morning and a 90-degree high temperature during the afternoon, this is just an example here. If we add those two together and we get the average temperature for the day, it'd be 80 degrees. Pretty simple, right? 70, 90, You're going to be right in the middle at 80 there. So what we do with that 65 is we're taking 80 and we're subtracting it by 65, and that's going to give us 15 cooling degree days. So that's kind of how we sum up cooling degree days. And I'm assuming that's how the meteorologists at Duke Energy are able to do that as well. And when it comes down to not only cooling degree days, but just the heat in general, we've been seeing hotter summers recently. Have you guys noticed any changes within Duke Energy that you guys have had due to some of the hotter summers that we've been experiencing here recently?
Well, it's interesting because there is a certain time of year that we're in now where it is just hot, and certainly I just did some quick lookups before we met, and we are seeing, last week, for example, I think it was like 141 cooling degree days or somewhere around there for the Charlotte area, and that was about 50 above the normal. So you are seeing a little bit higher than normal temperatures and demand for electricity. But when you compare it to last year, it's only about 13 above last year. So what that tells me is yeah, we're a little above normal, but it's pretty consistent with what we saw last year. What we have seen, though, is that some of those high temperature days and that higher electricity usage is starting to creep into what we might call the shoulder months, the months that typically you see lower bills, April, May, maybe not the time when the heat has arrived, but that heat is starting to arrive earlier in many respects and linger later in the year. And that probably has some bearing on some of the types of storms that we've seen off the coast, some of the weather patterns that we see. And when you have all that energy in the air, that can also generate a lot of severe weather, and that can lead to power outages. So all of that is important to us as we look at everyday's usage and what we see on our system.
And nonprofit group Climate Central, I want to pull up another graphic here. It just kind of shows just how much we have increased when it comes down to cooling degree days. Nonprofit group Climate Central, they do a lot of research on different climate data. And study in Charlotte from 1970 to 2022, we've seen a dramatic increase in cooling degree days, meaning that we are seeing hotter days. But, I was talking about cooling degree days in general, but we also have something called heating degree days as well. And I have heard that during the winter, demand's actually higher for you guys. Is that correct?
That's actually right. It doesn't seem intuitive in the South. You'd think it would be in the middle of the summer. We did set a record last week for summer usage early in the week when we saw those really hot temperatures, but that wasn't an all-time peak. Our all-time peak was actually during the winter, I believe, of last year. And so we have a lot of heating usage here in the Carolinas, and a lot of that is electricity based. And so we do tend to see our highest usage in January, February. I mean, that said, August and July and now June are not that far behind, but you're right. We are what we call a winter peaking utility often, even though we've got this other peak that happens during the summer.
Welcome back into Pinpoint Weather University here on Queen City News Plus. It is a July 4th weekend, and the Chicago Street Course for NASCAR is back for year 3. And it has unfortunately not been the best race when it comes down to weather. NASCAR, they said 2 years ago they wanted to do a street course. So they brought in the Chicago Street Course in 2023. And both years, 2023 and 2024, it has rained, Andrew. And as a big NASCAR fan like myself, it has been miserable because this had so much, opportunity to have NASCAR on the streets of Chicago. It's July 4th weekend. It's a really exciting just opportunity for NASCAR to really show off what they can do as a sport on the street course there. And unfortunately, the last 2 years, the weather has not cooperated. I think the first year, Andrew, in 2023, there were tires literally floating down pit road.
What?
From some of the flooding. I think, I can't remember the exact stat, but it was like one of the most historic rainfall days ever in Chicago history in 2023 when NASCAR tried to take the track, the Cup Series there in 2023. So hopefully NASCAR can get some better luck this weekend. I do want to talk a little bit about the forecast here.
Here we go again.
Hot and muggy, yes, hot and muggy. Storm chances back in the forecast this weekend, Andrew. And I mean, it's just that time of year. If you're going to do any activities during the summer months, you've got to get ready for storm chances, especially with the muggy air and just the hot conditions.
I think the interesting thing is because this is a thing that just tends to happen across this part of the country. Really, a great place to go would be like the desert Southwest, like I don't know, like Phoenix, or something. I'm just spitballing here. Because I like the idea of a street course. It's really cool. Everyone talks about sort of F1 when they do like Monaco and that stuff, like the tight turns. But we're doing something similar with NASCAR with a street course. It's a really cool and novel idea, and I'm a fan of it. It's just you got to know your climate. You got to know your atmosphere when you're picking to do a city like Chicago, historic city, one of the most important cities that we have in the country. Mm-hmm. And I understand why they want to do it, but you got to pick a place where it's going to be more than likely dry, and it's one of those things where this is something you're going to be dealing with every single year. It's that time of year. You're going to get summer storms.
And another thing, too, Mexico City, they went to Mexico City in pretty much the summer. And in Mexico right now, it's the rainy season.
Yep.
It's just like...
Do they have a meteorologist on staff?
I've been trying to go for that job, I think, for the last 20 years since I've been watching the sport and dreamed of it. But, no, I mean, and the joke, there's a running joke on social media, Andrew, if you are in a drought, just put a NASCAR race there. And it'll rain. Rain follows the track. So we'll see what happens this weekend. Fingers crossed we can get the race in. It's going to be hot and muggy. Storm chances are going to be there. It's not a washout day. But there's going to be hit or miss showers and storms. Now, our Independence Day weekend here in the Carolinas, Andrew, I've got some good news for us. We're going to be seeing lower humidity. It's still going to be hot, but... Yep. We're at least going to have low humidity. I think that's the big story.
It's at least going to be tolerable out there across the Carolinas. Less humid, better weather in general compared to what we've seen, which has been day after day, afternoon showers and storms, afternoon showers and storms, afternoon showers and
Yes.
storms. At least we get rid of that and see some drier weather. No issues for the fireworks as we get to your your Friday afternoon and Friday evening on your Independence Day. So we should be in good shape for that. Don't try to light them off yourself. Just enjoy. Let the professionals do it, everyone, okay? But that's neither here nor there. But your 4th of July weekend looking pretty dry here across the Carolinas. Slight chance of a shower on Sunday, but if I were a betting man, I'm not. That's Brandon's purview. Anyway, if I were, I would say more than likely we're going to stay dry the entire weekend.
I definitely wouldn't bet on the weather. The weather's hard, especially here in Charlotte during the summer months. I mean, even like a day like today, I was like, I thought we'd get 90 degrees on this Wednesday, but the clouds haven't broken.
Wrong.
And yeah, I was wrong. I was like, man, 925 levels hot. So, oh well, we'll talk more science and
nerding
more,
out.
Yeah, more nerding out with Pinpoint Weather University in future episodes. But for now, on this episode of Pinpoint Weather University on Queen City News Plus, we're going to go ahead and call it quits for you. Hopefully everybody has a safe 4th of July weekend. Andrew, any plans for you?
No real plans. I'm going to be working here Friday night. I'm going to be watching the fireworks probably from Independence Boulevard camera, more than likely, Brandon. Yeah. But, always a great time. The wife's out of town, so it's just going to be me grilling by myself, getting my burgers and dogs for solo for a little bit.
Well, leave me some leftovers when I get back. I'm going to West Virginia this week, and we got the Charleston Sternwell Regatta up there. Big Charleston Sternwell boats will be up there, so it should be a good time. And luckily, there's low humidity up there too, Andrew. So we'll take it. So low humidity, toasty weekend for the 4th of July. Keep it safe. Just take care of each other out there at the fireworks. And please, 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 guys, go into work Monday with all your fingers on. That's all we want.
Be smart, everyone.
All right, guys. Everybody take care. Have a good one. Be safe. We'll see you next week for another edition of Pinpoint Weather University.
Queen City News Plus. Just search Queen City News on your smart TV's app store.